The Great Depression was the deepest and strongest lasting economic downturn in the history of the Western industrialized world. In the United States, the Great Depression began soon after the stock market crash of October 1929, which sent Wall Street into a panic and wiped out millions of investors. The American economy entered an ordinary recession during the summer of 1929 as consumer spending dropped and unsold goods began to pile up, slowing production. At the same time, stock prices continued to rise and by the fall of the year had reached levels that could not be justified by anticipated future earnings. On October 24, 1929, the stock market bubble finally burst as investors began dumping shares en masse. A record 12.9 million shares were traded that day, known as Black Thursday. 5 days later, on Black Tuesday, some 16 million shares were traded after another wave of panic swept Wall Street. Millions of shares ended up worthless, and those investors who had bought stocks on margin with borrowed money were wiped out completely. As consumer confidence vanished in the wake-up of the stock market crash, the downturn in spending and investment led factories and other business to slow down production and construction and begin firing their workers. For those who were lucky enough to remain employed, wages fell and buying power decreased. Many Americans forced to buy on credit fell into debt. The number of foreclosures and repossessions climbed steadily. Despite assurances from President Herbert Hoover and other leaders that the crisis would run its course, matters continued to get worse over the next 3 years. By 1930, 4 million Americans looking for work could not find it. That number had risen to 6 million in 1931. Meanwhile, the country's industrial production had dropped by half. Bread lines, soup kitchens, and rising numbers of homeless people became more and more common in America's towns and cities. Farmers, who had been struggling with their own economic depression for much of the 1920s due to drought and falling food prices, couldn't afford to harvest their crops and were forced to leave them rotting in their fields while people elsewhere starved. In the fall of 1930, the first of 4 waves of banking panics began, as a large number of investors lost confidence in the solvency of their banks and demanded deposits in cash, forcing banks to liquidate loans in order to supplement their insufficient cash reserves on hand. Bank runs swept the United States again in spring and fall of 1931 and the fall of 1932, and by early 1933, thousands of banks had closed their doors. In the face of this dire situation, Hoover's administration tried supporting failing banks and other institutions with government loans. The idea was that the banks in turn would loan to businessmen which would be able to hire back their employees. Hoover, a Republican who had formerly served as U.S. Secretary of Commerce, believed that the government should not directly intervene in the economy and that it did not have the responsibility to create jobs or provide economic relief for its citizens. In 1932, however, with the country mired in the depths of the Great Depression and some 13 to 15 million people unemployed, Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt won an overwhelming victory in the presidential election. By Inauguration Day on March 4, 1933, every U.S. state had ordered all remaining banks to close at the end of the 4th wave of banking panics, and the U.S. Treasury didn't have enough cash to pay all government workers. Roosevelt took immediate action to address the country's economic woes, first announcing a 4-day bank holiday during which all banks would close so that the Congress could pass reform legislation and reopen those banks determined to be sound. He also began addressing the public directly over the radio in a series of talks, and these so-called fireside chats went a long way towards restoring public confidence. During Roosevelt's first 100 days in office, his administration passed legislation that aimed to stabilize industrial and agricultural production, create jobs, and stimulate recovery. In addition, Roosevelt sought to reform the financial system, creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation or FDIC to protect depositors' accounts, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, to regulate the stock market and prevent abuses of the kind that led to the 1929 crash. Among the programs and institutions of the New Deal that aided in recovery from the Great Depression were the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built dams and hydroelectric projects to control flooding and provide electric power to the impoverished Tennessee Valley region of the South, a permanent jobs program that employed 8.5 million people from 1935 to 1943. After showing early signs of recovery, beginning in the spring of 1933, the economy continued to improve throughout the next 3 years, during which real GDP grew at an average rate of 9% per year. The common view among economic historians is the Great Depression ended with the advent of World War II. Many economists believe that government spending on the war caused or at least accelerated recovery from the Great Depression, though some consider that it did not play a very large role in the recovery. It did help in reducing unemployment. The U.S. entry into the war in 1941 finally eliminated the last effects from the Great Depression and brought the U.S. unemployment rate down below 10%. In the U.S., massive war spending doubled economic growth rates, either masking the effects of the Depression or essentially ending the Depression. Businessmen ignored the mounting national debt and heavy new taxes, redoubling their efforts for greater output to take advantage of generous government contracts.